Welcome to China Spectrum. I'm Elena Claire. Today, we are exploring the vibrant trends, social shifts, and daily life in modern China. Let's dive in. What happens when the world's most popular investment story turns out to be built on sand? In early 2025, the Reserve Bank of India released a number that should have sent shockwaves through every trading floor on Earth. Net foreign direct investment inflows for the fiscal year ending March 2025 had collapsed from $10,100 million to just $353 million. That is a drop of 96.5%. The figure was later revised upward to $959 million, but even at nearly $1 billion, the message remained devastatingly clear. A country of 1.4 billion people, marketed for an entire decade as the inevitable successor to China as the world's factory, had attracted virtually no net foreign investment. Then came the summer of 2025, and with it, a reckoning that finally exposed what those numbers had already been telling us. As temperatures reached 46 degrees Celsius across the subcontinent, India's electricity grid simply broke. Air conditioners went silent. Factories stopped mid-cycle. Hospitals operated by torchlight. Traffic lights went dark. Freshly poured concrete cured into useless lumps in the heat. This was not a hypothetical climate disaster. This was a normal Tuesday in Mumbai, Wednesday in Delhi, Thursday in Bangalore. The heat wave itself did not cause the investment collapse. The fiscal year had already closed, and nearly $81 billion in capital outflows were already recorded. But the extreme heat served as an X-ray, illuminating with brutal clarity every structural fracture that had already driven foreign investors toward the exits. The grid failure, the blacked-out factories, the stranded supply chains. These were not new problems. They were old diseases that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. How does a country go from being crowned the next China to becoming a statistical rounding error in global investment? The answer requires looking past the sales pitch and examining what actually happens when you try to build things in India. The story that was sold to investors for more than a decade. The global investment community has been sold one of the most seductive stories in emerging markets. India, with its 1.4 billion people, its median age of 28, and its seemingly endless supply of cheap labor, was poised to inherit China's position as the world's manufacturing hub. Wall Street built lucrative investment theses around it. Western politicians made regular pilgrimages to New Delhi. Even China's own business leaders sounded notes of alarm. It was by any measure the consensus trade of the 2020s. The version of India presented to global investors went roughly like this: young population, cheap labor, vast domestic market, democratic institutions, English-speaking workforce, give it time. The argument went, and sheer scale would do the work. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and virtually every major global bank published research framing India as the defining investment opportunity of the coming decade. There was only one problem with this thesis. The money arrived, but it never stayed. Economists have a phrase for the gap between narrative and reality in emerging markets. They call it the premium of hope over experience. In India's case, that premium has just been liquidated. 81 billion in, 80.7 billion out. Here is the number that should keep every India bull awake at night. In the fiscal year 2024 to 25, gross foreign direct investment inflows totaled $81 billion, a perfectly respectable increase of 13.7% year-on-year. On the surface, the India story appeared to be holding. Money was arriving. But gross numbers in emerging markets are a conjurer's trick. The figure that matters is what actually remains. After $80.7 billion flowed straight back out, the net was $353 million. That outflow breaks down into $51.5 billion in repatriation and disinvestment by foreign firms, plus $29.2 billion in overseas investment by Indian companies themselves. For perspective, that is roughly the amount a single large private equity fund might deploy in a slow quarter. It is a rounding error in global capital flows. Where is the money going? Multinationals are repatriating every dollar of profit they can extract. Firms that built factories are decommissioning production lines, selling off assets, and heading for the exits. Companies that had drawn up investment plans are quietly filing them away. And India's own billionaire class, the Ambanis, the Adanis, the industrial dynasties that are supposed to be building the new India, are with notable urgency moving their own capital offshore. This number demands explanation, and the answer lies not in any single policy failure, but in the compounding effect of structural weaknesses that have been festering for decades. The structural trap, the contours of India's economic trap, are best understood before examining its individual parts. Deficient infrastructure and a predatory business environment deter investment. The absence of investment prevents manufacturing growth. Without manufacturing, mass employment remains elusive. Without employment, social instability grows. And instability drives the government toward nationalist posturing and intensified predation. Every factor examined below feeds this vicious cycle. Why India's power sector was already broken long before the heatwave of 2025, India's electricity sector was a slow-motion disaster waiting to happen. The crisis that unfolded in April was merely the most visible symptom. The underlying disease had been growing worse for decades, and the Modi government's decade in power had, if anything, accelerated it. India does not lack generation capacity. Its coal reserves rank 5th globally. Its solar potential is among the richest on Earth. Total installed capacity stands at 520.51 gigawatts, 3rd in the world. The problem is that the entire institutional architecture connecting generation to the consumer is broken. At the generation end, state-owned thermal plants operate well below global efficiency benchmarks, with plant load factors averaging around 69%. Coal supply chains are chronically disrupted. Equipment is ancient. At the transmission and distribution end, things get genuinely absurd. Aggregate technical and commercial losses run at 15.04%, meaning roughly 1/7 of all generated power vanishes en route, stolen or lost through decaying infrastructure. In some states, distribution losses exceed 50%. Then there are the distribution companies, known as discoms, which constitute perhaps the most intractable problem in Indian political economy. Nearly all of them are insolvent. Why? Because state governments, in a permanent quest for electoral favor, have supplied farmers and low-income households with free or nearly free power for decades. Revenues do not cover operating costs. The discoms cannot afford to invest in their networks. The networks deteriorate. Losses rise. Deficits deepen. Investment becomes even less affordable. This is a death spiral. And Modi's much-heralded power sector reforms have done essentially nothing to stop it. Rural electrification rates have improved on paper, but supply is so unreliable as to be meaningless. Transmission losses have ticked down by a cosmetic few percentage points. Discom losses have, in fact, grown worse, requiring ever larger infusions of central government subsidy, more than $20 billion annually, simply to avoid total collapse. This was the system into which the summer of 2025 arrived. When extreme heat met a broken grid, the trigger for the grid's collapse was almost absurdly simple. It got hot. From April 2025, a heat wave of historic intensity settled over more than 20 Indian states. Temperatures breached 46 degrees Celsius day after day. Rajasthan touched 48 degrees in remote areas. Surface temperatures crossed 60 degrees Celsius. The heat arrived a full month earlier than seasonal norms and blanketed 2/3 of the country. Electricity demand, predictably, went vertical. It surged from just over 200 gigawatts to more than 250 gigawatts inside a single month. And India's patchwork, decades-old grid, starved of investment and riddled with technical losses, did exactly what fragile systems do under extreme stress. It broke. Major cities faced rolling blackouts as demand outstripped supply, with commercial districts and industrial zones among the hardest hit. In Bangalore, India's self-styled Silicon Valley, server farms went offline, and international orders stalled, dealing a direct blow to the carefully cultivated image of India as a digital services hub. Rural areas, as always, bore the worst. 3 to 4 hours of electricity a day, delivered in the small hours of the night. And here lies the chronic dimension that no policy can address. India is emerging as one of the countries most severely exposed to extreme heat in a warming world. Climate models project that 46-degree summers will become routine across large parts of the country in the coming decades, with some regions breaching 50 degrees Celsius. The physiology is unforgiving. Above 35 degrees Celsius, human efficiency degrades measurably. Above 40 degrees, sustained outdoor labor becomes medically dangerous. The implication is stark. For 3 to 4 months of every year, India's capacity for outdoor construction and a large proportion of its industrial production will be materially impaired. While competitor nations run at full capacity year-round, India operates at a permanent quarterly discount. You can build more power plants, you can harden the grid, you can air-condition the factories. But you cannot air-condition a country. India will never be the all-weather factory that China became. A factory that runs 365 days a year, not because of policy failure, but because of physics. Nature has imposed a ceiling on Indian manufacturing that no industrial policy can raise. Why blackouts threaten manufacturing survival? To understand why all of this matters for the investment case, and why foreign capital has been fleeing, you have to appreciate what a power cut does to a modern factory. An automotive assembly line that loses power mid-weld produces scrap, not cars. Cleaning solidified paint out of automated spray equipment takes days. In a semiconductor fabrication plant, lose power for seconds and you lose the cleanroom environment, turning millions of dollars of wafers into inert silicon discs. In a textile mill, looms jam, yarn snaps, and delivery schedules collapse. The cascading damage is worse than the immediate loss. Late delivery penalties destroy margins. Customers who cannot rely on your output migrate to competitors in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, and China. Yield rates fall, unit costs rise. And the entire operation loses its claim on international competitiveness. Frequent power interruptions also degrade precision equipment calibration, compounding India's structural yield gap with China. Apple's experience in India is instructive. Foxconn, Pegatron, and Tata collectively poured over $5 billion into Indian iPhone assembly. With analysts targeting 25% of global production by 2025. The results? Yields of roughly 85%, compared with 98% or more in China. Production costs run 14% higher. The arithmetic is unforgiving. India's domestic manufacturers have fared even worse. Textiles and garments, one of India's largest export sectors employing 45 million workers, saw over a third of mills forced to cut or halt production. The heat wave pushed the sector past its breaking point, but the underlying vulnerability was always structural. Aging equipment, high power costs, and an infrastructure deficit had been eroding Indian textiles' competitiveness for years. Export orders fled to Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Cambodia. In April and May 2025 alone, manufacturing growth slowed to a crawl, with industrial output barely expanding and direct losses north of $12 billion. The World Bank estimated the annual cost of India's power sector dysfunction at over 4% of GDP, more than $86 billion a year in 2018, and higher in absolute terms today. That is GDP effectively torched by the electricity system. Ask yourself honestly, if you managed a multi-billion-dollar global manufacturing portfolio, would you write a check for a country where the power can vanish without warning, for hours at a time, in 46-degree heat? Capital's deepest aversion is to uncontrollable, unpredictable risk. India, in 2025, served up all of it at once. Infrastructure that never shed its colonial past. The power grid is not an isolated case. India's transport, logistics, and port infrastructure tell the same story of chronic underinvestment compounded by political paralysis. The railway network, fourth largest on Earth, remains substantially what the British built. Multiple incompatible gauges, decrepit rolling stock, and average freight speeds of 20 to 25 kilometers per hour. The road network, over 30% unpaved, dissolving into impassable mud with every monsoon. The country's largest container port, Jawaharlal Nehru Port in Mumbai, turns containers around in over 24 hours. Shenzhen does it in under 10. And then comes the political dimension. India's federal structure gives enormous power to state governments, which means that anything requiring interstate coordination, whether a highway, a power transmission corridor, or a unified tax regime, becomes a negotiation that can consume a decade. Attempts at national tax reform are fragmented by a thicket of state-level surcharges. The idea of a genuinely unified national market is a legal and political fiction. The result is a country structurally incapable of the kind of concentrated, centrally coordinated infrastructure build-out that transformed China. A highway that takes China 2 to 3 years from planning to ribbon cutting takes India a decade, or two, or never. Elon Musk once pointed out that Tesla built a complete gigafactory in China in 357 days, while land acquisition alone in India could take 5 years. That comparison is not hyperbole, it is a concise summary of the entire Indian infrastructure dilemma. For foreign investors weighing where to place their next factory, this infrastructure deficit translates directly into higher costs, longer lead times, and greater uncertainty, the three things that capital most reliably flees. Why global business has learned to fear India, even where the physical infrastructure holds. The regulatory environment punishes success. Climate and geography set the floor, while governance pulls the ceiling down further. There is a saying that circulates among global business executives who have tried to operate in India. India is a country you can check into, but you can never check out of. It is only a slight exaggeration. Modi's Make in India program, launched with considerable fanfare in 2014, promised the world liberalized foreign investment rules, streamlined approvals, and fiscal incentives. Multinationals responded. They committed capital, transferred technology, built factories, and hired workers. Then the dynamic shifted. Once the investment was sunk, the government changed the terms. Laws were rewritten, taxes were imposed retroactively. Fines running into billions of dollars appeared, often on grounds that independent legal analysts have described as tenuous at best. The case of Xiaomi has become emblematic. The Chinese smartphone maker entered India in 2014 and executed what should have been a textbook emerging market success: high-value products, rapid market share capture of over 30% at its peak, local manufacturing, and over 20,000 Indian employees. At the height of this success, India's Enforcement Directorate froze approximately $670 million, virtually all of Xiaomi's accumulated Indian profits, on allegations of illegal remittances. The funds remain frozen. Xiaomi's market share has collapsed to roughly 8%. The company has effectively been partially expropriated. The pattern repeats across sectors and nationalities. Vodafone invested over $20 billion, then was hit with a $2.7 billion retroactive tax demand, a decade of litigation, and promoters who were substantially diluted. Ford operated for more than 20 years, accumulated over $2 billion in losses, and shuttered all factories. General Motors, Nokia. The roster of global brands that entered India with ambition and left with losses reads like a who's who of industrial capitalism. International capital has absorbed the lesson. India is now widely classified as a high-risk jurisdiction. Many multinationals have concluded explicitly that they would rather pay higher wages in Vietnam or Mexico than accept the regulatory and legal risk of operating in India. The government's effective policy, attract the investment, let it mature, then expropriate, has exhausted the world's trust, and trust, once lost in the world of foreign direct investment, takes decades to rebuild, far longer than a typical investment horizon. The demographic dividend that became a liability. There is a final dimension to the India story that the bullish consensus consistently overlooks. The country's celebrated demographic dividend has long since curdled into a demographic liability. The argument seemed airtight. Young workers are productive workers, and India has more of them than anyone. But this arithmetic only works if those workers can read, can acquire skills, and can function in a modern industrial environment. India's workforce overwhelmingly cannot. The aggregate literacy rate hovers around 77%. The rate for women is roughly 70%. These figures overstate functional capability considerably, since a large proportion of the nominally literate can do little more than sign their names. In rural areas, lower caste children drop out of school in early adolescence and enter the informal labor market, never receiving anything approaching a complete education. The vocational training system barely exists. India's own National Statistical Office reports that among the working-age population between 15 and 59, a mere 4.2% have received formal skills training. The remaining 95.8% enter the workforce with no marketable capabilities. Firms that attempt to train them face a permanent risk that their investment will simply walk out the door. Female labor force participation. Perhaps the single most powerful engine of East Asian industrialization, sits below 40%, among the lowest rates in the world. Hundreds of millions of Indian women are effectively absent from the formal economy. China's transformation into the world's factory was powered in no small part by female participation rates above 60%. India has left half its workforce on the sidelines. Unlike the climate, these are problems that policy can fix, and that makes their persistence all the more telling. Literacy rates, vocational training, female workforce participation. These are not acts of God. They are the product of political choices, budgetary allocations, and institutional priorities that India, after decades of rapid GDP growth and a 10-year government with an overwhelming parliamentary majority, has made so little progress on any of these fronts, speaks to something deeper than capacity constraints. It speaks to a political system that has simply not prioritized the unglamorous work of human capital formation, because the returns take longer than an electoral cycle to materialize. How the vicious cycle feeds itself, every factor examined above operates at a different level, and they do not simply add up, they multiply. The climate ceiling is the hardest constraint, because no policy can raise it. For 3 to 4 months of every year, India's manufacturing capacity is materially impaired by temperatures that make sustained industrial labor dangerous and, in some conditions, impossible. This is not a problem any government can solve. It is a permanent competitive disadvantage relative to countries in temperate zones. The power sector rot and infrastructure deficit are policy failures that amplified that climate shock. A well-maintained grid with modern transmission infrastructure might have weathered the 2025 heatwave. Instead, decades of neglect turned a seasonal weather event into a national economic crisis, demonstrating to every foreign investor watching that India cannot guarantee the most basic industrial input of reliable electricity. The regulatory predation then deterred investment from returning even in sectors unaffected by heat. Foreign firms with existing Indian operations accelerated profit repatriation, while prospective investors redirected capital to jurisdictions where the legal and regulatory environment is predictable. The government's pattern of retroactive taxation and enforcement-driven expropriation has created a reputational liability that compounds every year. And the human capital gap means India lacks the workforce to compete, even if the other problems were somehow solved. A country where fewer than 5% of workers have formal skills training cannot hope to operate at the productivity levels required for competitive global manufacturing, regardless of how much capital it attracts or how many power plants it builds. The electoral incentives facing any Indian prime minister make genuine reform politically costly. Touching the discoms means ending free power for voters. Raising taxes to fund infrastructure means higher costs for consumers. Cracking down on state-level surcharges means political warfare with coalition partners. The path of least resistance has been to trade structural reform for electoral survival. The result is a government that excels at spectacle. International summits, carefully staged photo opportunities, grandiose infrastructure ceremonies. A procession of resonant slogans: Make in India, Digital India, Clean India, Self-Reliant India, each launched with maximal publicity and minimal follow-through. A new parliament building and prime minister's residence constructed at vast expense while the national power grid buckles. The production-linked incentive scheme, a $26 billion program launched in 2020 as the centerpiece of India's manufacturing push, tells the story in numbers. 4 years in, participating firms have generated just 37% of targeted output. Government incentive disbursements total $1.73 billion, under 7% of commitments as of October 2024. Manufacturing's share of GDP has not risen from its 2014 level of 16%. It has fallen to approximately 14%. The 2025 target has been quietly pushed to 2035. The scheme that was supposed to transform Indian manufacturing has become, in practice, a promise deferred by a decade. No shortcuts. And no more illusions. The India of 2025 has given the world a masterclass in what happens when a country attempts to skip the difficult parts of industrialization. And the $353 million in net foreign direct investment is the clearest scoreboard of all. The mistakes India has made are not unique. Many late developing nations have attempted the same shortcuts, driven by the conviction that population scale plus market size will, through some inexorable economic logic, yield industrialization. They do not. Industrialization has never been a product of marketing, of slogans, of investment conferences, or of the extraction of foreign capital for short-term political purposes. Industrialization requires, and has always required, decades of grinding, unglamorous work. The patient construction of infrastructure networks. The cultivation through education of a genuinely capable workforce. The maintenance of stable and predictable policy environments. The building of unified domestic markets. And the operation of competent and reasonably honest government. None of these can be purchased. None can be accelerated by rhetoric. China became the world's factory not through luck or geographic destiny, but because successive generations did the heavy lifting. They built the world's most advanced infrastructure, educated hundreds of millions through compulsory schooling, sustained a reform process that created a relatively transparent business environment, and constructed the most complete industrial supply chain on the planet. These are not accidents of history. They are the accumulated product of difficult choices sustained over decades. The $353 million figure is not a statistical anomaly. It is the logical endpoint of a development strategy that substituted slogans for infrastructure, predation for partnership, and the illusion of a demographic dividend for the reality of an unskilled workforce. Until India confronts these fundamentals and fixes its power grid, reforms its regulatory apparatus, ends the distribution company death spiral, and closes the human capital deficit, the money will continue to leave. And the summer of 2025 will look, in retrospect, less like a crisis and more like a preview. That is all for today's stories. To keep discovering the real China, please subscribe to China Spectrum. I'm Elena Claire. See you next time.